looks like we're going to take a red teamer's point of view, how we break things. Are you guys ready to break some stuff? I'm pretty excited. Niru is a staff security engineer at Google. Give her a minute to get on screen. Here we go. Here we go.
Hey, how's it going?
Hello. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you for your patience. We really appreciate it. We are ready to hear your talk on Red Teamer's point of view, how we break things. Looking forward to this. I got to tell you, Niru, while you're getting started, and go ahead and share your screen. This is amazing. How many tech talks? I mean, how many times do you go to a women's conference and it's all about the feelings? And we've got some, back-to-back technical talks going on. I'm loving this. I hope the audience is as well. I'm sure they are. We've got some of the ladies out there. They've been on for 16 hours straight. Pretty amazing. And that's a lot of caffeine. All right. Niru, tell us about yourself. Where are you coming from?
Hey, I'm a security engineer from Google, and I am a tech lead manager on the offensive security team, which is like the internal security red team at Google.
Oh, fantastic. And where in the world are you? Because we've got people from all over.
Yeah, I'm based out of the Bay Area, so near San Francisco.
Oh, San Francisco. Okay, yeah. Fantastic. Fantastic. All right, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Cool. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, cool. Awesome. To kick things off, hey everyone, I'm going to talk about a red teamer's perspective today, specifically how we approach problems and how we break things. Kind of did a brief intro with Jessica, but hey, I'm a security engineer at Google, and I'm a tech lead manager on the red team. So that means I do a bit of individual contributor stuff, that is hands-on technical stuff, but also I manage people. And my primary responsibilities are leading and participating in red team exercises and taking care of the overall program. And what that primarily entails is we simulate adversaries that are trying to break into Google and try to identify how things are broken so we can help people fix it. Cool. With that, we'll dive into the talk. And we'll start with first defining what red team exercises are. So what are red team exercises? They're basically exercises where we simulate real threat actors that are attacking information systems. And the primary motivation for this is to be a sparring partner for DNR. So we're trying to figure out, can our security controls prevent these attackers? And then can we detect them once they're in our systems? And usually after the exercise, we work very closely with these blue teams and DNR teams by walking them through what we did, by talking through, hey, what are the signals that got triggered? How can we improve them? Here are some detection ideas. And it's a very cordial relationship, and we really enjoy working with them. Besides that, we actually try to really illustrate how an attacker moves through a network. So at the end of the day, like, we can say, okay, how does the system hold up against things? You can threat model it, but think about this as the actual simulation of once an attacker gets into your company, how are they moving through your company? Can you see them do it? What are the controls that hold up? What are the controls that need more work? So oftentimes we'll start with a foothold where, hey, this is a random employee within the company. They were compromised. So now from here, how do we get to our objective? And what are the various things we try? Besides that, it's about drawing attention to the business impact of these security issues and just raising security awareness as a whole. And the nice thing about red team exercises, it's a neatly packaged story at the end of the day, because it's about, hey, what did the attacker do? How did they achieve their goals? What was the outcome? And we juxtapose that with, hey, these are the issues we identified. This is the contextualized risk for it, and these are ways to fix it. So it's really nicely packaged, and it shows you a story that people really want to engage with. But yeah, in short, as one of my colleagues likes to call it, it's APT cosplay. This is a common question that comes up is, hey, great, we have red teams, but how are they different from, let's say, a review or a pen test? And I think kind of looking at the different attributes they have and putting them next to each other helps illustrate this quite cleanly. At the end of the day, they all have value, and you should really pick what works best for your use case, and where one of these might work, the other might not, and this kind of is just to walk through it and illustrate it. Let's start with the goals. A security reviews is primarily aimed at a specific system, and you're trying to identify all the issues in a system and make sure you address it. A penetration test is where you're enumerating as many of the vulnerabilities as possible, not necessarily trying to capture everything because it's typically time boxed. And you're just trying to say, okay, what are all the vulnerabilities I can find? Can I illustrate the exploitability of each of these? And it's just framed in that way. Whereas the red team isn't necessarily about finding all the vulnerabilities in the system. It's more like, let's assign a goal, what we're trying to achieve. So let's say, let's steal the emails of various people. That would be a goal. And then we assign a profile, that is, who is the attacker you're simulating, and we try to use that as a lens for how we go about it. So it's not so much as finding all the vulnerabilities in the system, but more like what are the vulnerabilities we can use that's available to get to the objective that we need. So it's really focusing on the weaknesses that will help us achieve the goal. Next comes the level of knowledge that is available at the start of each of these engagements. For a review, oftentimes you are going to be working alongside these teams and helping them assess their systems. So it could be anything from all of the information available for code and design, maybe even working closely with the folks who write these systems. Pen tests it depends on the terms of the engagement. It could be limited to no access to code. It could also be all of the code is available and you have some insider knowledge that you can also tap into. A red team, it will depend on the profile you choose for it. So you could be an external attacker, you could be a malicious insider, you could be somewhere in between as well. Next comes the scope. Oftentimes the review is really focused on a specific product or service, and that makes sense because you're really diving into the details, you're making sure you find all the issues, and anything beyond that is going to be hard to do in a reasonable time. Pen test will vary. Oftentimes, it'll depend on what the pen test end goal is. It could be compliance driven, it could be an external perimeter test. So it'll depend on the terms of engagement and what the company is hoping to get out of it. And a red team, the scope oftentimes is really the whole company, because you're asking the question of, if an attacker is trying to get to this objective, how can they get there? That isn't to say that we should give in to scope creep, but it's more like we will draw a rough scope of these are the systems that we think is most interesting, but we keep expanding that scope by taking a step back, and we'll walk further into this in the next slides. So at the end of the day, the real reason to like put them next to each other and talk through them is to show that all of these have value, but we should make sure we use the right tool for the job. If you're asking, is the system secure? You probably need a review. If you're asking, can an attacker get to this? That's more writing. So let's just set the stage now. Let's pick a hypothetical scenario. Again, this is a hypothetical scenario. Any resemblance in Paris to the real world is purely coincidental. All of y'all should absolutely try astronaut ice cream if you haven't. So here we have a scenario where a malicious insider is attempting to steal and sell delicious astronaut ice cream from Cosmo X, who's managed to absolutely nail the formula and everyone loves their ice cream. So their competitor decides, hey, we are going to pay off someone within that company to steal their ice cream formula. So let's break this scenario down into goals and the attacker profile. The goals are pretty straightforward. I mean, if you look at it, you're like, okay, how do you break this down? You want to first access the recipe, and you want to exfiltrate, that is, steal the recipe out of the company. Attacker profile, you might want to read between the lines a little bit. Sure, we laid it out as malicious insider, but what does that actually mean? It means you need to have familiarity with, the internal systems already because you're an insider. You're likely working alone. So that means you might have limited time and resources. We're not going to do the same things we would do if you're simulating a state actor, because they have a lot of time and resources compared to someone working alone. Next comes, like if you're an insider, you have a lot to lose. You don't want to get caught, especially not before your goals are achieved. So we're trying to remain as stealthy as possible. And we're going to use all of these attributes as kind of like our North Star as we work through what we do during an engagement. Before we dive into what can we attack and how do we attack it, I think it's important to understand what are the stages of an attack. So if you look at the attack framework, there are various frameworks available, and one of the most popular ones is the MITRE attack framework. I've kind of taken it and put it into broader buckets here for you, but I highly recommend reading the attack framework if you have time. So let's start with the first step, which is recon. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's like looking around and trying to find information about the systems and your target, basically. And as you kind of gather this information, you might start working towards a foothold. As its name implies, it's really the first foot in through the door. So this is where you first end up once you compromise someone in the company, or once you compromise system in the company. That starting point is called a foothold. So once you're in the target's infrastructure, the next thing you have to do is, sure, now I have a foot into the door, but how do I make sure I don't lose access? How do I make sure they don't push me out the door? So the post-exploitation stage is where that comes in. It can be achieving persistence, that is making sure you don't lose access. It can be escalating your privileges. So if you're starting with someone who's less privileged user, how can we get on to, let's say, from a standard user or a web server to a root? It's also about taking stock of what you now have access to and prepping for the next stage. And that's where lateral movement comes in. Oftentimes when you start with your foothold, unless you're really lucky, you're not going to land exactly where you want. You're just really trying to get into the target's infrastructure, not so much say, I want to land in this tiny team which has access to what we want. That's pretty hard to do. So oftentimes the lateral movement is where you're like, hey, I have access to this system A, but to get to the objectives, I need to be somewhere in C. So you start working towards C, and that's the lateral movement bit. Then comes the objective. Of course, this is the most important thing about the red team, right? What are we trying to achieve? What is our goal? Is it stealing data? Is it modifying things? Is it introducing a backdoor? All of these are objectives that we assign at the start of the exercise. So in this particular scenario, the objective is to steal the recipe, right? And the other important thing to remember is we're starting as an insider here. So we might choose to forego the steps of foothold and post-exploitation here, but we could also decide to keep it. And there's value in that, in the sense that if you start as a malicious insider and you compromise a different person and you perform all your actions through that person, you now have some plausible deniability and an additional layer that exists between you as a malicious insider and the person who's doing the actions, or the machine that's being used and the account that's being used to perform the actions. So you have this additional layer available. This really depends on, one, the time we have, and as well as what we're hoping to achieve and show. So now that we've walked through the various stages of the attack, let's start talking about what we can attack. And whenever we ask people, okay, what do you attack to get to these goals? The first thing that's going to come to their mind is the systems. And that's pretty standard, right? Like as engineers, we oftentimes think about the system as the core thing we want to target. Sorry about the leaf blower. I'll try to move this here. The core thing we want to target is the systems. And the thing is, if we take a step back, that isn't the only thing we can target, right? There are other aspects we can look at. It can be the people who work with these systems. It can be the processes that support these systems. And at the end of the day, if getting to any of these is going to get to our goals, these are all within scope at that point. And as a malicious insider in the scenario, we actually have a lot of internal resources available to us that we can use to determine a lot more information that's going to help us target any of these facets. Cool. With that, let's start diving into processes and how we can target them. Actually, let me start with systems and switch back and then switch over again. How can we target systems? The most obvious thing we can think about is, let's start with the design. Design is a nice abstraction. You're not really in the weeds yet, but it's enough of a view where you're like, hey, this is how the system works. This is how it plugs into other systems. What are interesting things to target? Beyond that, we can start diving into the code. And one thing to remember is that if you have a good CI/CD pipeline, and let's say whatever is checked into head is what is deployed at this point in time, this is the closest you're going to get to ground truth in a way where you can parse it and easily understand it, right? So treat this as your ground truth. At the end of the day, the documentation, while it has a lot of useful information, can be out of date. But the code, if the CI/CD pipeline is well-defined and you know this is what is deployed, is a good ground source of truth. And it's going to be a lot more up to date than your design docs. So this is where we oftentimes will rely on for an accurate representation of the current state. And we'll be like, hey, this is how it works. Sure, this is how it's now no longer like the design actually describes it. And we'll kind of use this as our main starting point for how we look at certain things. Then comes the systems it interacts with. So we aren't necessarily looking at just the main systems we want to target. So let's say the recipe holder is a system that we want to target for the ice cream recipe. But that isn't necessarily the only thing we can target, right? We can target, let's say, the sourcing portal, because people have to buy the ingredients to make the ice cream. And if we can figure out what ingredients they have, we're one step closer to figuring out how to make the recipe. We might not know the exact proportions, but even knowing the ingredients is a good step forward. Then comes the mechanisms that are used for interactions. And this is often overlooked things. It's just the pipes between the systems, right? At the end of the day, these pipes carry the same data that these systems handle. And if you're after the data, why not look at the pipes as well? Then comes the endpoints that are available. So how can you interact with the system? What are the various options you have? What's available to you in terms of the access you currently hold? If you manage to kind of like move laterally, does that give you additional access? And these endpoints, you kind of ask yourself, are these old endpoints? Are there some which are exposed or some that are not exposed? Are there outdated ones that are no longer being maintained and might be less secure than the new ones? Besides that, an obvious one is the storage systems, right? You have to store the recipe somewhere. Databases in general are great things to go after when going after data. So that's a pretty standard one. Finally, while we can look at all of these systems and how they were written, how they function, it's also important to look at how they configured. So it's not just the system itself, but the configurations for the systems that are also helpful to go after. We can look at it and see, are there any security settings turned on and off? Are there some things that you can toggle it off yourself? And I guess like a more current example would be, is it using Log4j? Are there some things that you can use to your advantage to get to it? So now that we talked through the systems, let's talk about the processes that support these systems and why they're important to look at as well. At the end of the day, anything that exists that's there to help people, employees kind of, understand the system, maintain it, build it, is going to be useful documentation for attackers as well. So onboarding guides, handbooks, playbooks, these are all great resources for us to use to try and understand how the system works. Because we are also kind of trying to do the same thing. How does the system work? How can we change things with it? How can we interact with it? Of course, we're approaching it from a malicious standpoint, but it's really just the same questions that we're trying to answer as someone who perhaps is new to the team and trying to understand how the system works as well. Then comes developer workflows. So CI/CD pipelines, what is being currently deployed? When is it deployed? Like, what is the schedule being used? Do they have rollback? How do they roll back systems? And what are the different options available? The next thing is what are the prod, staging, and dev environments, and how do they vary? These are all good questions to ask, because sometimes you might be able to target dev instances and realize that you have access to prod data because it's been misconfigured. Then there's debugging or troubleshooting things that you can look at, which is what are the debugging processes? Can you abuse it to get access to information that you want? The final facet, I think all of us know, is the people, right? And as attackers, people are definitely one of the things that are oftentimes targeted and oftentimes quoted as being the weakest link, but also it's the most unreliable link, right? Because even if you try to phish people and send emails, you can't guarantee that people are going to see it. You don't know how they're going to respond to it. Maybe they'll raise an alarm, maybe they won't. It really is a dice roll sometimes. And social engineering, be it phishing attacks, being watering hole attacks, which is where we ask, we post something and we just wait for people to come to us. And all of this is just at its baseline, tricking people to perform a specific action. And as an insider, you kind of know how a company works. You have a certain degree of trust that you can leverage, and you can definitely use the right language that people are expecting within the company. Besides that, you can target not just the systems that that are hosting information, but actually the employees' workstations themselves. So what are some things on the employee's workstation? Is it an outdated OS? Are they running applications that have issues? All of this is fair game to consider at this point in time. Then comes the softwares or tools that they're using alongside resources that they own. So taking a look at, okay, what is the standard text editor they use? Are there plugins that they're using that happen to be vulnerable to known issues? And then what are the resources that they're owning that you can now, as them, access and gain control of? So all of this is great. We discussed these various options of attacking these three facets, but what if none of this pans out? That does happen a lot. Most of Red Team is honestly like failing and trying again. And we usually like take a step back and think about it. It's like, do we have issues that we have found, but don't necessarily lead to the goal? But what if we string them together? So maybe we could modify config files, but we have no way of deploying it. Then maybe we can modify the config files and then trick someone into deploying it. The next option is to take a step back and look at it, right? Like at the end of the day, the scope for this is the whole company. So sure, we couldn't get to the recipe store directly, but what are other options we can look at? Let's go to the sourcing portal. Maybe the sourcing portal will give us the ingredients, and then maybe we can find the ratio of those ingredients elsewhere. Then comes research. This one also, keep in mind, we need to apply the attacker profile lens here. Trying to look for a 0 day every single time isn't really reasonable. And if you're doing a malicious insider, should you be doing a 0 day? Is that within the capabilities? Those are all questions we need to ask. But you can always research the tech stacks available and see if there are any vulnerabilities that exist that might not have been patched yet. Then comes the simulation aspect. We've tried stuff, nothing stuck, we've hit a roadblock. So this is when we take a step back and say, can we simulate that step to unblock that particular aspect of the attack chain and then proceed as normal from there? So maybe we threw a lot of things at the problem, but we never landed a foothold into the company. So this is when we say, can we recruit someone to be a willing victim where they kind of run our payload for us at our request? And then we assume compromise and we demonstrate all of the attack from that point in time. Then comes indirection. I think this one we've covered at length, but it's basically about moving laterally. Let's say we end up with someone in sales and they don't have access to the ice cream formula. Then we have to move to someone who has access to it. At the end of the day, one thing to keep in mind is even if you don't achieve the goals, there's a lot of value to be had. Be it saying, how did you get to the goals? What are the issues we found? Or even just saying, we tested the security control and we know it works. That is value added at the end of the day. And I think this is a very apt slide to wrap up with, which is what would an attacker do? This is the core premise that we always ask ourselves every time we try to do something. And one thing to keep in mind here is if we can always try different things, but if it doesn't fit our attacker profile, then we're not being true to the scenario or the profile that we've set for ourselves. Let's apply this in the scenario we chose right now, which is a malicious insider trying to steal the ice cream formula. Let's assume they're also a lone insider just to make things even clearer. And let's walk through what this entails. Given that they're a malicious insider, one of the core aspects we discussed is stealth. They don't want to get caught. So we might want to avoid certain things like social engineering campaigns, which are sent from internal stuff, because that would be easy to trace back. But we can use the knowledge we have and have like an external phishing campaign where it looks believable enough and it looks official enough, but it can't be traced back through internal things. Maybe we avoid things that would trigger an alert. So, hey, do you want to brute force passwords? Because that seems very loud and likely to get caught. The next thing is work to our strengths. We are an insider. We have a lot of internal knowledge. So leverage that. We're familiar with the CI/CD pipeline. Great. Use that to your advantage and figure out what happens. We also need to think about persistence. Do we want persistence? Is that likely to raise more alarm? Or do we think that that's important enough for us to maintain a foothold? In this case, I would argue that persistence would really depend on who we land on. If the method that we use for persistence is going to be very noticeable, we might opt to not do it. Maybe we do in-memory stuff and it's not noticeable and this is an acceptable risk for what we considered for this attacker, then we go ahead with it. The next bit I'm going to kind of fuse together, which is accessing large amounts of information and exfilling it. So there's multiple avenues available, and we'll basically ask, from this point where we've accessed the data, what is actually reachable? And we'll try to blend in with the traffic as much as possible. So we'll try to see, okay, what are legitimate use cases for us that we can reach from here that would also blend in with the traffic and try to use that to our advantage. So at the end of the day, I guess, one, we're trying to find the shortest path to the objective and demonstrate how an attacker would go. And we're basically walking a mile in their shoes. So I hope that this illustrates how a red team sets up a scenario and how they walk through it and how they ask questions and reason through it. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Very insightful. I think that will really give a great perspective into a red team mindset. I think oftentimes in cybersecurity, if you're in policy or if you're in one of the other areas, you don't really know what red teaming really looks like. So, Niru, thank you so much for giving that presentation.